start right on time, so let's do that. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the Friday Transportation Seminar at Portland State University. My name is Leming Wang. I'm co-hosting the seminar with Professor Avi Unikrishna this term. So for today, we're very pleased to have Jeff Frkonja to join us to speak on a topic that actually has a lot of implications for us in the planning process in the future. So Jeff joined Metro as the director for Metro Research Center in June. So he's very fresh, and we're very pleased to use this as an opportunity to welcome him to Portland. And for today, he will talk about, as his title indicates, decision support for transportation investment, primarily on the topic of on the technique of doing modeling support with least cost planning and multi-criteria evaluation. With that, I will just give the room to Jeff.
All right, thank you very much, Li Ming, and thanks everyone for coming and for having me here. It's an honor. I will try to live up to that honor. And I want to start out just by pointing out that the work I'm going to show you is really founded on work that a great many academics and professionals have done over many years. And so you'll see some of their names in the various source notes in the slides. So without going into that long list, I just want to thank all of them for their investment of time and thought in this realm. I'm going to talk about the material that was in the abstract online. The title today is a little less technically focused, but it's really the same presentation. And it's, as Li Ming said, the topic is really, in general, how we use analytics to inform decisions that, in the most cases, in this country at least, elected officials make to funnel transportation investments, whether those are in capital assets or programs or policies. And so I'm going to frame the discussion around some technical topics, but also some process things, and so hopefully there will be something here for everyone. And quickly we'll talk about what are the decisions at hand, so we have a grounding and a background for the topic matter and the technical applications. And then, since there are decisions to be made, what information is actually useful to that decision to give further grounding that leads to the technical question of what analytic techniques are actually going to produce that information. And then, as most folks know, there are some practitioners in the room that I've worked with before. It's not sufficient to have a technical toolkit. One has to have a planning process in which those outputs are realized in some useful way, in some trustworthy way, and so we'll talk briefly about that. There are several different types of decisions, particularly when you're talking about capital investments, and the least cost planning framework, and I'll get more into the details of some of the different frameworks that are available and my views of how they have converged somewhat over the years. It's often the case where one is asked to choose which alternative one is going to invest in. So it's an or decision. Do we invest in alternative A or do we invest in alternative C? There's also plenty of applications of this type of analytic framework to rank alternatives. So the question isn't so much whether or not to do something, but in which order to do things, because certain things deliver more value, and therefore they, in some value judgment, ought to be done first or sooner. And then in some of the applications of these frameworks that excite me, since I'm an analytic guy, you can actually use these techniques to design your alternatives. You can go through an iterative process of evaluating them and understanding which ones deliver more value and which ones deliver less, but then from those lessons, combining details of them into making better alternatives. So if C and A are great, then let's combine them and make D, and then we'll analyze D in some further process. And so there's a variety of ways to apply these, and it bears some thinking about what you're actually trying to do before you get started. And just to put some reality behind this, as you would imagine, there are all sorts of things one could choose to invest in. One can choose to invest in new or expanded roadways, transit systems, bicycle infrastructure, pedestrian infrastructure. There are a lot of policy choices that one can apply these frameworks to, pricing being one that's getting a lot of attention across the country and the world right now. But there are other policies one could have. For example, Seattle, where I worked for many years, has limited access lanes. More and more of them are being priced now, but many of them are just HOV only or high occupant vehicle only. And so that's a policy that one can test in these frameworks. And there are other things that are more difficult to test, but with the advances in our analytic technology are getting more tractable to analytic treatments. Those are things like commute trip reduction programs that try to get employers to offer choices to their folks, like cash out for parking to incentivize transit or bicycle use. And so there's a wide variety of things that can be subject to a decision support process. And so what information is needed and what analysis then provides that information? And I want to call out over the next couple of slides a couple dimensions to that information question that are sometimes, or in many cases, often relevant to the analyst and the planning folks. And part of the interest that stakeholders have in information about some decision their elected officials are going to make is often characterized as, how does it affect me? So if you look at things like the Metro's Mobility Corridors Atlas, you'll see that it actually pulls out individual corridors and talks about travel times. If one were to travel this corridor along its length on the primary arterial, how long would it take? Well, I submit that that's a me question. If I open this up, I'm going to say I live here and I work there. How long does it take me to get to work if you folks make that investment? And that's very useful because, of course, we're in a democracy, which is a good thing, and so the sum of the constituents' concerns matters. And as you would guess, in a future-oriented, what are we going to do in the future sense, those travel times come out of a predictive tool or a forecasting tool, the travel demand model. And how many people in the room have some exposure to the theory and mechanics of travel demand models? I just need sort of a grounding here. Okay, thank you. There's also, however, the challenge that, at least in my view of the profession, is the us question. So it's one thing to know how it affects me, but as an elected official or other decision maker, I hope that folks are looking at the how does it affect everyone question. And so we need to summarize those individual corridor findings. Okay, travel time along Route 217 is this, but across the whole region, what's really happening? And so there's this aggregate dimension to decision support information that is, I think, where the profession has spent a lot of its time. And so you'll see things coming out of the model like total vehicle hours of delay, or vehicle miles traveled per capita. And then now, of course, we are cognizant that there are other modes that deserve analytic support, which is wonderful. And so we've got bicycle miles traveled and other metrics that we aggregate together. These metrics don't say where those are happening or for which constituent they're happening. They say in total, alternative A produces this finding here, whereas alternative B produces that finding in aggregate. So if you look at the history of decision support analytics, it started in an economic sense with benefit cost analysis. This is my version of it. There's probably better versions of it, but I'm a practitioner, and so this is just my sort of lightweight version of the history. And so that's an economic lens, and we'll talk a little bit more about benefit cost analysis. The idea is that if one can monetize benefits, then one can talk about those benefits in economic terms and decide which alternatives have more economic value relative to other alternatives. And so that puts us in the realm of benefit cost analysis as an analytic technique, and it puts us in the realm also of economic impact analysis, which talks about indirect benefits such as changes in gross regional product, job creation, and things like that. But then stakeholders very appropriately started asking questions, well, okay, that's great. I mean, yes, we want economic prosperity, but what about effects on the environment? And so the analysts thought, well, okay, well, we can do emissions modeling, and we have those post-processors on the back ends of our travel models in the form of MOVES, which is the current EPA tool. If you get down to project-level analysis, there are noise models. There's water quality analytic techniques. There's habitat preservation techniques when you look at things like Washington State is doing at Snoqualmie Pass with actually creating ways for migrating herds of ungulates to get under the facility. And then, of course, other stakeholders said, well, that's great, but what about the social and health outcomes? And so how are we measuring those, and what's the value those give us? Well, the federal government, through executive orders, said that projects with federal money should do environmental justice analysis, and many organizations, Metro included, decided that they wanted to do their own equity analysis regardless of whether there was federal money involved. And so we have equity types of analysis techniques, and there are things like health impact assessments that talk about what's the effect on mortality and morbidity. And as you can see from this, we are adding up to a lot of decision support analytic frameworks. So we've got individual metrics we could pull out, like those corridor travel times. You've got sort of some type of equity assessment framework, environmental impact analysis. Many states, as well as the federal government, have specific requirements for that. Health impact assessment, which is looking at costs to human health. And then all the ones that I started with, the economic layer of least cost planning, benefit cost analysis, and economic impact analysis. And so the planners and the ethics of the planning profession are suggesting that we're responsible as public servants and planners in really looking at things broadly. So what's going on across all these dimensions? And so you probably heard of the idea of the triple bottom line, which says we need to look at economic outcomes, we need to look at environmental outcomes, we need to look at human, social, and health outcomes. And so in a sense, we are committed now through the evolution of these techniques ethically to a comprehensive view of everything that folks value. And you can call it the triple bottom line, you can call it something else, but really that's what we're trying to do as analysts, is to address all those dimensions of value fairly and as completely as we can. I promised to talk a little bit about least cost planning. Least cost planning is one of these decision support frameworks that originated in the power generation industry. It was, in sort of one version of the story, it was an attempt to upgrade the capability of benefit cost analysis to look at other options such as conservation as opposed to just capital asset construction. And so it was, in my view of the history at least, a step up toward the triple bottom line. We were looking at capital investments. We were assuming we were going to have a straight line growth of power generation needs, so we had to build more and more capital stuff. And someone said, wait a second, what about conservation? There's another way to do this. And so that was a step away from a straightforward assumption that we're always going to be building more capital stuff. And then other dimensions of value were layered into the equation, and the framework evolved. Now, that does create the challenge. I mean, accepting that we have the ethical responsibility to address all those dimensions, it creates a big challenge. We've got a huge pile of information to sort through now. And so in attempting to deal with all that information and also to give it appropriate priority, some folks thought, well, suppose we actually structure the way that we compare these different dimensions of value. And so they conceived of the idea of multi-criterion evaluation. There are many other terms for it. Some of the acronyms are things like MCDA and so on. But this is a conceptual diagram of what an MCE framework tries to do or aspires to do. It's going to say that there is some, for a given alternative, like plan alternative A versus plan alternative B, but for a given alternative, there are some criteria of value that we are going to analytically assess. And they have their own measures. So each criterion has a measure. So it could be the mobility benefits, which would be the travel time savings aggregated across all of the region under analysis relative to some no-action case. Well, okay, that's the measure, mobility benefits. But how do we weight that versus other dimensions of value? Well, in this abstract case, the 4 primary criteria are all given equal weight. They're given 25% weight toward the overall score. But as you might imagine, some of those criteria aren't so simple. There are actually multiple dimensions of economic benefit. There are mobility benefits, there are reliability benefits, there are cost savings that are direct. And so maybe there need to be a couple dimensions there. Well, the question then is begged, what's the weight of those dimensions? And so again, in this abstract example, those sub-criteria each have equal weight, 33%, and one constructs the analytic framework, designs the measures, engages policymakers in the weighting exercise because, again, this is a good thing. We live in a democracy, and since they are the elected officials who decide, their weights are what matters in a democracy. We can roll it all up and say, okay, we've got a score for this alternative relative to other alternatives. And so that's the ideal, the analytic ideal. And analytic hierarchy processing is a specific flavor of this that takes on the multi-criterion framework, but then takes on the task of actually using statistical means of assigning the weights through essentially a forced stated preference survey of the decision makers. So what does this look like when we apply this to the travel demand model, which I asked if some of you folks are familiar with? Here's a high-level conceptual sketch of how we do this in a place like Metro, or may do this, because we're now asking ourselves, in fact, I'm speaking to our council next week to see what direction they're going to give us. Should we build this part of the toolkit in the orange box? And if so, what should it look like? What we already have at Metro are these other dimensions of analytic tools. We've got tools that let us forecast future population and employment within the region. We have tools, Metroscope, that then forecast an allocation of where households and firms will locate within the region. That information is part of what I call the modeling chain. So those inputs travel downstream to the travel demand model that basically says, where are people going to travel? How are they going to travel? Are they going to take car? Are they going to take transit? Are they going to bike? Are they going to walk? And then, as you saw in earlier slides, the travel model produces certain outputs, such as vehicle miles traveled, measures of delay, travel times on facilities, and so on and so forth, transit loadings. In our case, we have a bicycle model that talks about bicycle route choice. And in a lot of past analysis, things stop there. But the frameworks I'm talking about today add this layer that talk about what the benefit-cost analysis results are to put an economic lens on it. We talk then about many other aspects. So there are equity dimensions and there are environmental dimensions that hopefully we can quantify with some toolkit. And since, remember, we're ethically bound to talk about everything, even if there are things that we can't quantify, we can't ignore them. So there often is, in these modern applications, some qualitative dimension that we have to address in some way overtly, even if we can't put it into dollar terms or into other quantities. And then once one applies the toolkit, one produces a series of findings that go to the decision makers. And I need to remind everyone that, again, the tools don't make the decision. They produce information that goes to the decision makers. So I always liken these things to include some helpful links and references so folks can find examples and useful things as well as information on methods. And so this is just a short list. There's a lot of literature out there on these techniques. In fact, people in the room may actually be creating some of that now or in their future careers. The federal government, US DOT and its various branches, has a lot of information on this, and there are tools there. And these slides, I'm told, will be on the web, so don't try to write down the URLs, I suggest. The American Association of State and Highway Transportation Professionals commissioned an actual guidance book. They call it the Red Book because it used to be bound. Now it's on PDF, of course, but it used to be bound in red. Eco Northwest staff, actually, a firm that's located here in the Portland area, did a lot of the lead work on that. ODOT, Oregon Department of Transportation, has designed an Excel-based tool called Mosaic. It's actually available on the line. This actually is an example of the dimensions of value that Mosaic calls out. The Transportation Review Board, the national research branch that a lot of us as transportation professionals engage in, has an amazing amount of research on this. And Caltrans, our colleagues down the street in California, the state DOT there, have done a lot of both practical tools and some theoretical work on this. So I've got about 8 minutes, well, 8 to 15 minutes left to talk about some more details. And this is really skimming the surface, right? In 30 to 35 minutes, there's an immense amount of analytic detail here, as I hope you realize. But what do we get when we start applying the whole genre of sort of multi-criterion tools that try to learn from all these techniques that people have developed and package them in some useful way together? Well, here's just some comparisons of work that I've been involved in or seen done. Remember, the mobility atlas is something that has that, what I call the me view. So I'm traveling from here to there. How long does it take? Well, what's the aggregate treatment of that? Well, here's the sort of the benefit cost version of that. We monetize the time savings. We monetize the reliability benefits of improvements to reliability, separate from just saving travel time. There are out-of-pocket costs that we all face when we travel. And there are dimensions of things that if policies or other things preclude user use of a facility or choice of a mode or choice of a route, then that's actually a cost to that user. They can't afford to pay for that in whatever terms of payment or mode choice or whatever have you. And so that's a cost to them. We need to be fair to capture that dimension. And so what you can get is you can get this graphical comparison that talks about all these different value elements in monetary terms, and therefore they're comparable. And it gives you the aggregation, too, across the region, which is actually very valuable. It's very difficult to look at 25 different corridors in the region and see 25 different travel times and try to synthesize that into, is this complete package of things better or worse? It can be more useful for people to see, oh, okay, total benefits to everyone in the system are X. And as you can see, these bars actually, it's not labeled here. This is a simplified graphic, but each bar is a separate alternative. And this is a case both of designing new alternatives. There were 5 preliminaries. The best features of those were put into a preliminary preferred, which, as you can see, delivers more value, so the design was working. And then the final preferred alternative is the dark blue. So at each generation of alternative iteration, the design got better and delivered more value. So that was an economic example. And this is a case of a more fine-grained economic value result from a benefit cost tool. These are per-trip user benefits to areas of the region that have high concentrations of cluster groups, which are certain firm groups of economic activity. For example, the chip makers out in Hillsboro or logistics folks that serve the port. This is benefits to locations that have high amounts of freight traffic. These are benefits to locations that have concentrations of high-wage jobs. And this is the regional average of all the benefits. So what you can see here is that the preferred alternative has a lot of value relative to the original alternatives for all of the economic activity concentrations. If you then get into environmental, this is the change in amounts or values, because you can convert to value easily for all the criteria pollutants plus CO2, which is our greenhouse gas culprit, across all those alternatives. And of course, in sort of the previous way of doing this, one would have independent measures of tons of pollutants and other things. And so the roll-up benefit of these techniques is by design. We're trying to combine measures into some rolled-up score, in this case money. And here's the example of the roll-up. So this is work that I was involved with at Sandag. This is actually a draft result, so this isn't Sandag's work. This is my private file when I was consulting. But here's what you get. You get a total benefit cost ratio of this plan alternative versus hypothetical here. And you can see that the one that this is one Sandag actually designed at some point in their planning process. It has a positive or a greater than 1 benefit cost ratio, which says its net benefits are greater than its net costs. And here are those different value dimensions. So I've out here, I've called out whether each of those dimensions fits into one of the 3 legs of the triple bottom line. And this is the total net benefit in dollar terms. And the idea, again, is to report, okay, if people want to just look at, well, give me the number. There's one number. The benefit cost ratio is sort of the people who like one number, they can look at that. But we know that stakeholders and constituents and interest groups care about the details. So we report out, okay, what are we doing for human safety? Well, we've reduced accidents to the tune of a large savings. What about physical activity? What about the human health aspects of that? Well, this alternative doesn't do so well there, whereas the hypothetical does a lot better. So if one was somewhere in the planning process, one might argue that we really need to do something about that. So maybe there's some design, maybe there's some investments or programs we should put into the next generation of that alternative. And then equity is a place that in my professional work I've really found these frameworks to be valuable because it's a very important conversation. And what happens in a lot of the sort of the older way of doing things is that people talk about how much money are we spending in this area where a lot of low-income folks live or a lot of minorities live. And that, if you think about it for a while, that may not really be the right way to look at it. And I have a slide later, if we have time, I'll show why I think that's not perhaps the most productive way. But if you actually then can look at the total benefits accruing to those populations in the system, you can say, okay, what's going on with low-income folks? And you can see right here that the per work trip benefits to the low-income groups were actually negative in some of the preliminary alternatives. They got a lot better in the final alternatives. And for a variety of reasons, the per trip benefits to high-income groups are just greater. So that's information that helps. But this is total benefits to all of these populations in the system with these different alternatives. So we're not worried about where we're spending the money. We're worried about what's actually happening for them, regardless of where the money's being spent. And you can also do geographic comparisons. So there is, of course, often a question of, is a certain part of the region getting its fair share? Well, you can look at this geographically with these techniques and say, okay, these happen to be the planning sub-areas of Puget Sound Regional Council's planning area. You can see that Kitsap County, which is west of Seattle across Puget Sound, even though it's part of the same planning area, actually enjoys above average benefits in the final alternative. So you can talk about geographic equity. Again, getting past this, are we spending the money in Kitsap County, getting to are the benefits accruing to Kitsap County discussion. And, you know, there are ways then those are the graphical representation. One can then, to the extent that the technology and the analytic toolkit allows, tease out those different dimensions of value for the region as a whole versus this is San Diego Association of Governments work, versus what they call communities of concern. That's their term, not mine. But those refer to populations with low income or certain minorities that are relevant to their community. And so you can see that these are the percentage breakouts by, in this case, poverty groups. And so there's just different ways of showing equity in a comprehensive and aggregate sense. So getting down to close to the end here, but I just wanted to talk about, so what does this all do for us? You know, it gives us more apples to apples comparison when it's technologically feasible. That's by design. It lets us summarize things. It lets us roll things up. It lets us do geographic and market segment comparisons. We can talk about equity in a number of different ways. And it really, because of investments in the individual criteria evaluation methods, can give us a lot of better methods for dealing with some of these dimensions of value. And again, I've called out equity. There's work in the slide deck about reliability you can look at, and there's a lot of Sharp 2 research on reliability and how to value it. And so that's, if you're interested in that, there's a great pool of literature that's emerging now. So there are some principles here that I'm going to skip over because I'm going to talk a little bit about process before I run out of time and open it up for questions. I assume that most folks... Oh, okay. All right. Well, I've gotten more time then, so you'll have to suffer through my speaking a little longer. I just want to point this out, that because of the immense amount of work that many people in the past 30 to 40 years have invested in this, there is a body of best practice and literature that talks about how one should do these things, and it's wise to pay attention to that. So I've talked about already the fact that taken together, we're sort of ethically responsible for making sure that we are comprehensive in the metrics. We're not ignoring dimensions of value and therefore excluding certain populations from consideration. Also, to be analytically robust, we have to make sure we're not double counting things. So the converse of that is we have to make sure that those metrics are mutually exclusive. It's not fair to count certain things once and then change the name and count it again, because that biases the result. And as I've already mentioned, because we live in a democracy, the weighting process should be done democratically. The elected officials who make the decision are the ones whose weights count. And that's actually a hard message for some people, but again, it comes down to the way our system of government works. If you don't like their weights, then you can elect different elected officials. But their weights count because we've empowered them with that decision. And then, all good planning and analytic practice, right? Be transparent. So actually engage the stakeholders, show them how the tools work, show them what the weights are. I've learned, and I'll talk more about this later if we have time, that it's wise to publish all the results. So a lot of people thought when these techniques came out, oh, we're just going to show everyone the benefit-cost ratio and we'll be done. Well, no. People do care about the details, and so it's incumbent upon us as analysts to expose those. Naturally, we expose all of our assumptions and methods. And then, as I've already said, we need to make sure that people know what the weights are, because they may disagree with those. There are some advanced techniques that actually let each individual stakeholder go in, and you can do this on the web with some things. You can just set your own weights. If I was the decision maker, what's the decision I would make, which is actually useful. Now, this all sounds great, but let's be real. There are some complications and challenges. As you would probably already suppose, there are many criteria that are difficult to monetize, much less quantify, although we're getting better at that. And that's where a lot of the exciting research is happening right now, in my opinion. And so we just have to be cognizant of that and deal with it. And now there's some of the underlying theory here, and this can get into math, which I trust most of you are enthused about because you're in this seminar. But I'm not going to go into the details here because we don't have time, but most of the benefit cost calculations are based on theories of economics that talk about consumer surplus, which basically says on this graph, if you make it less costly to acquire a good, in this case, travel from some origin to some destination, then economic theory says one will see more consumption of that good. So cost is on y-axis and demand is on the x-axis. So as cost drops, demand increases. And since users are willing to pay a certain amount, but they're constrained by their resources to be able to pay only a certain amount, that difference is called consumer surplus. If I go to work this morning and I'm willing to spend $8, but I only had to spend $5, I've got $3 I could spend on something else. And so that $3 extra, that's my consumer surplus. That's value to me. And so this is the theoretical foundation of a lot of the benefit cost analysis that says, now I've got some money I can do something else with. If I spend that, I'm a bicyclist, so if I go to a bike store here and get a new bike, I've stimulated economic activity. That's of value to society. So this is the theoretical foundation. And former colleague Vince Bernardin and a team wrote a great paper on this. Here's the citation for Ohio DOT. It really has a nice, it's actually in the appendix, but there's a really nice explanation of all this. And here's some details on sort of how we did this when I was consulting for RSG and working for the San Diego Association of Governments. In an activity-based model framework, or any framework, one has to put value on travel time by monetizing it. And so it's actually, the old saying, time is money. Well, if it takes me 35 minutes to get to work, but then some other investment lets me do it in 25, I've saved 10 minutes, which I can invest in some other activity that has value. And we can put that in dollar terms. And this is actually a way to do this, that valuation in an activity-based model framework that RSG developed. There are then values of time, not just for personal travel, but for sort of freight travel. So these are truck values of time from a variety of studies that have been done throughout the past. And you can see there's a range of dollar values per hour there. This is one of the theoretical discussion points in the field right now. How much should we actually value that at? But there's also the reliability dimension, and I called out the Sharp research. The LO5 report has some actual practical stuff in it if you want to do your own applications. And I'm going to fast forward now because I'm getting down to where I should talk a little bit about the process. This is just a generic planning process that one could engage in if you were to employ this type of framework. It's useful to identify which actions you're going to decide on. So is it a project level evaluation? Is it a region-wide plan alternative? Is it something in between, sub area? You, as I've already pointed out, I think you need to choose your criteria, which means identifying your dimensions of value. You need to then get your methods lined up. And again, there's a lot of tools you can just grab to do this with now. And try to make things as comparable as you can. You do have to figure out how to weight things. And some agencies, I'll point out, just have decided not to do that. They're just going to expose all of the measures and metrics and let the decision makers do the weighting in their minds as they make the decision, and that's perfectly fine. But that's a decision. You just have to recognize that in some cases no decision is a decision because it does, as you saw in the mobility benefits chart, the mobility benefits region-wide tend to, in monetary terms, without any weighting at all, dominate all other benefit dimensions. So you have to decide what to do about that. And then, of course, you apply the evaluation analytically. You report the evaluation findings to the decision makers, and hopefully they will find that useful. But some of the lessons learned, this isn't just me, but my colleagues in the field. I've already mentioned the first point. I don't think it's wise to assume that the single benefit cost ratio is really that informative and useful. It's therefore useful to say, okay, here's what's happening on health. Here's what's happening on emissions. Here's what's happening on all these layers of detail. So make that information available. Be forthright. It's really important to consciously and mindfully have some communications and outreach plan. If as Metro may choose to do, one is developing this as an upgrade to or an enhancement of some existing decision framework, then these metrics will be new. And the benefit cost metric is often very new to decision makers in my experience. And so it's natural for them to say, well, wait a second, I haven't seen this before. How does it work? What does it do? What does it mean? And if you don't proactively take steps to answer those questions, then they would be quite within their rights to say, I don't want to go there. Why should I care about that? Tell me why I should care about that. And this is something I've been doing this 20-odd years now. This being general, travel demand analytics and related analytic stuff. And I think that there was some enthusiasm with many folks who designed these analytic frameworks that if we get the analytics right, then people will stop questioning them. We're going to have this perfect framework, and we won't talk anymore about is the analysis right or the numbers right. We'll just get to talk about what they mean for the decision. I think now, given where I am in my career, that's naive. I think that we have to simply expect that people will always question the analytics, and sometimes they do so legitimately because they don't understand them. And we can help those people as analysts because we can explain it to them and say, here's how it works. It's not a black box. I mean, frankly, just give them the software, but then help them understand it would be my suggestion. But then there are tactical reasons why people question the analysis, right? And that requires a little more nuanced communication style. They don't really care whether it works or not. They just want to shoot it down for whatever reason. And so, one just has to be, in my advice, careful to work with the folks who are sincere in their questions and work with the folks who are doing it for some other reason because they're stakeholders and we owe them that consideration. So that's my pitch for some process thoughts. And I have reached the point where I wanted to open it up for questions and discussion. I will say that I know that you folks have to ask questions, so I want to respect that. But if people do want to offer some thoughts on the questions that I've posed on the screen here, I'd be happy to hear that as well. So with that, I'll turn it over to Li Ming, or actually you folks. Li Ming will offer questions from those folks who are online, but you folks can raise your hand and I can call on you. So, yes, sir.
So, is this a hard sell for the elected official who isn't very math savvy?
I think the short answer is yes, it's a hard sell for a lot of elected officials. I'm not so sure that it's so much about math savviness. I think it's really about helping them trust the tool, which in my view isn't so much about whether they are skilled at math. It's about whether you can help them to understand the value proposition that the tool is exposing, which can be literally this one is better. You saw the bar chart. The bar charts are designed so people can look at it and not know math and see better, less good, bad, right? So in those cases, I think this cycles back to what I call the education and outreach component. If you bring the decision makers along as you're designing the process and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. We're going to and make the examples vivid to them in real world terms, like reliability. What does reliability mean? Well, it means that, literally, if the system is so unreliable that I have to spend an extra hour or budget an extra hour to travel to work in the morning rather than just driving the 25 minutes that it would be, or in my case, bicycling the 30 minutes that it would be, free flow bicycle path, right? If you put it in those terms, then I think you can sort of sidestep the math. So the outreach and education component, really to everyone. How many people in the region actually have the math to understand those? It's just not fair to say, here's the math, trust it, right? We have to put it in real terms. So that's my answer. It's not about math. It's about showing it what it means. Sure. Yes, sir.
David Werner, civil engineering. Identify myself.
Travis Glick. But who's paying for that extra outreach? They don't have the technical expertise to understand the math, and you need to be able to go in and acknowledge their concerns. Who's paying for that extra involvement to make sure it works?
Well, that's a great question. Let me answer that in the context of public agencies where I've worked and faced that question. In modern American practice, because of an accumulation of federal and local laws and just sort of ethics in the field. American Planning Association has a code of ethics. You can find it on their website, right? There are ways we do things. And if you're doing an environmental impact analysis under federal law, you are required to do early and regular public outreach, right? And that includes, or stakeholder outreach, however the details are phrased. And so to a certain extent, there's sort of everyone in the region, and then there's the people who care about the decision sort of explicitly, and then there are the decision makers who have responsibility. So there are sort of layers of constituency, if you will. But to answer your question, the public agencies that are making the decision have to find a way to fund that, if they're going to do that outreach, or at least resource that. And some of them choose to engage other organizations, there are professional associations, there are advocacy groups, and so there are techniques that our planning colleagues have learned to put together meaningful outreach campaigns and get the message out. And it isn't so much, I mean, yes, the agency who's leading the planning effort or making the decision, whether it's a state DOT or a regional agency like Metro or a city, has a lot of skin in the game and therefore has to pay staff to shepherd the planning process through. The very well-designed outreach efforts I've been part of have leveraged a lot of community interest, so other people are investing their time, their organization's time, whether it's a city or a county or a nonprofit advocacy group or a nonprofit association of trades or firms. So you sort of get all those folks, and you leverage the fact that they have communications channels, they have constituents they can reach very quickly, and so you try to maximize the sort of the outreach buck. You know, if you invest this much staff time, hopefully you're leveraging that with all these other organizations. Does that answer your question? It also comes down to the fact that, yes, we have to spend more in the planning process to make sure we show people how the new thing works, but every time there's a new thing, you have to do that. So,
one follow-up. You are a public agency that is hiring out to private firms that exist within your city. You have a plan to expand whatever project it is. Is it the organization you hire's responsibility to reach out to the public and explain what they're designing, or the public agencies that's hiring them?
Generally the public agency, because if you look at, I mean, I'm not an expert on the law, but if you look at the way the regulations, like federal regulations, the state regulations are generally phrased, the agency that's making the decision really has primary responsibility. In federal terms, you'll see something called the lead agency. So the lead agency, and if you're doing a federal NEPA project, it really is kind of ultimately responsible. Other questions?
Oh, yes, sir. So my question is, how do you, as a public, agency like Metro, use the MCE techniques to make sure, I guess, just to make sure that no cities use or dominate the MCE evaluation, like say the city of Portland, the weight, like say, outweighs other smaller cities. I know that MCE you need to have input from the policy, the people in power, but in reality, not each city has equal power. So I guess the question is, how do you make sure that MCE is not trying to use to push certain cities' agenda or certain policymaker, like the council members, their view upon the other cities? Because people are very suspicious of the MCE. Sometimes they know that because city of Portland dominates the conversation. The people they hire, they receive direction from the council, and they will try to push a certain result, rather than you can easily do that in the MCE. So I guess, how do you try to avoid that? How do you address people who are less powerful, but they still need to be heard? The smaller cities, like Oregon City or.
Well, this is a great question, and it would take hours, I think, to explore it. But let me try. I think there's actually more than one question in there. Part of you use the term power. So in that context, I'm going to answer by saying that the actual decision-making power that agencies have is a matter of law and intergovernmental agreement. So in terms of relative power, that's what's often called a governance question. In other words, who has the power to actually make the decision? And I'll refer you to Metro's bylaws and protocols on how its committees are formed and how council may act or not act on that question. So the question of sort of who has the power to make the decision is in a realm that I'm not really qualified to talk about, if I can sort of put that one off the table. But in terms of your other question, which is I would interpret as, are the analytic results kind of meaningful and fair? That gets into what I call analytic integrity. So I believe that as an analyst, my job is to expose information as objectively as the tools and technologies and resources allow. And if you phrase it as Portland has more power in an analytic sense, I would say that our analytic tools right now, as I've discussed them so far, do not actually weight subpopulations of the analytic region differently in terms of just because who they are or where they live. The ones I've shown you about equity expose information about people who are deemed by policy or choice to require such attention, low-income populations, for example. And so we talk about low-income populations, and we can talk about them in terms of the fact that they are concentrated in certain areas, which is generally, if you look at the map, you can see that, right? But we do not generally say that a low-income population in Portland is somehow more deserving of attention than a low-income population in Gresham or Hillsborough or other places. And were one to do that, I think to start saying that there is some sort of other dimension of weighting there, in my professional opinion, you start to get on pretty thin ice. So at this point, the analytics, as that I've narrated them so far, are generally applied in a way that people are equal no matter where they live in the analysis area. So it's in the fact that Portland has a lot more people makes effects that touch those people kind of hit the analysis results harder, but that's because they have more people. It's not because they're in Portland. It's not Portland, it's just because there's more people there. So the general assumption is that you're not going to say that person X living there gets more weight than person Y living somewhere else. So the tool is sort of agnostic to where you live. It captures the results for you, but it's up to the decision maker to decide if that distinction matters, Portland versus Gresham or whatever.
I was really thinking about, because Portland is such economically powerful, over all other smaller cities, and probably more likely council members, based on, different region, right? Maybe more, I'll just say, hypothetically, maybe more council members are from Portland. And because Portland is such economically important, it's like heart, engine for the region. So what City of Portland I think is, very important, say, certain way of transport mode that maybe this way, this, I think might dominate, the views of, some other, smaller cities. So I'm not really talking about the population, where you live, but more important is, the fundamental power structure, because you are the engine of, this union. So of course, what you think, probably is more important. The city, council member decide that probably will be translated somehow into the, metro. And I'm not using example. I'm just hypothetically speaking. And also, how do you make sure independence of the MCE analysis, with the sometimes all the directions from the your committee from the higher level. So how you stay independence of your analysis? I mean, I know it's a paradox. You need to get guidance from them. You need to wait, but then at the same time, you need to kind of.
Well, there's a couple. Again, I think the first part of your remark speaks to what I've labeled the governance issues. So I'm going to, relegate that to the lawyers and the people who design our system of government. But when you talk about how do you make sure that the analysis is sort of robust and valid and fair, that gets back to analytic integrity and it gets back to the transparency. So if you do this right, you've exposed all those choices. Here's the method for valuing travel time. Here's the method for valuing reliability. Here's the method for evaluating environmental benefits and social benefits. And here are tools where we can, if decision makers ask, is Portland benefiting collectively more than Gresham, as I pointed out, that analysis can be done because we have geographic reporting capabilities and other things. But we would have to be told as analysts that question is important. And it, again, I would submit that it's not ethically viable to for us to assume without explicit direction from our decision makers that we should be weighting things sort of jurisdiction against jurisdiction. That would generally consider to be bad form. But your point also is Portland, because of its population and its economic concentration of activity, just carries more weight. But remember, if we're assuming that we're analyzing the metro region, metro is responsible for the metro region. So the unit of analysis is the region. Are there questions of balance and equity within that? Well, certainly. And the toolkit can speak to those. But it's one thing for the tool to tell you in objective analytic terms what's happening for a Gresham or a Tigard versus the tool to be programmed to automatically weight what's going on in Tigard or Gresham or Portland differently unless that was agreed upon by the decision makers. So let me be clear, the weighting process is a value judgment. It is value, it is subjective by design, okay? The metrics, the design of those are analytic and should be objective. So my answer would be that if those questions were if we were told, okay, the analysis has to talk to this, I would say, okay, the metrics should be applied in this way. We can bring those forward. If you then choose to apply weights to make things balance out differently, that can be done. But you, decision makers, would have to tell us, this is by whatever rules of politics and governance structure we have, this is our decision for you then to implement analytically. We could go do that. I see Li Ming has a hand here.
The evolution of analytic methodology from PCA to LCD and then to MCE. I got a question online to say, what are the drawbacks of MCE that you perceive and how you can address them?
The question was, what are the drawbacks of multi-criterion evaluation and how might we address them? I think there's an overall drawback that I've already cited, which is because of our ethical mandate to be inclusive of all dimensions of value, there's just a huge pile of information. So it's always a challenge. What do you do with just this massive information? Because people, as I've said, just aren't satisfied with one benefit-cost ratio. They want to look at the details, but as soon as they dive into the details, they're wallowing in huge amounts of information. So just information and communications management is a challenge. It's huge, frankly. And it's where some of these things break down in my experience. If you don't, your question, if you don't help the decision makers understand what the tool is telling them, then you basically are shot from the beginning, right? You're not going to get anywhere because they're just going to, quite appropriately, they're spending billions of dollars of public money. They're going to say, I'm not going to go there. I'm going to use the old way. The other dimension is technical, which is that in 30 minutes, I have glossed over a lot of the detailed methods of assessing things like reliability, for example, or environmental benefits, another example. And so, for example, what does one do with endangered species? What's the value of an endangered species? To some people, and this is where it gets really tough, those are priceless. They dominate everything. And that may be the answer. Okay, if the elected officials decide that that is the answer, there are ways to structure this so it isn't all rolled up. You can do it in stages where you can have a process that if the decision makers agree that there are certain values that trump everything else, and that's their democratic decision, legitimately arrived at, then the planning process can be designed to say, okay, screening, step one, fatal flaws. If it's got a fatal flaw, it's just out. We're not going to do that. And so you can sort of manage the decision. And again, you get down to what really differentiates things. So the way that analysts can help cut through the huge pile of information is really help the stakeholders and decision makers focus on what differentiates alternatives. If every alternative basically scores the same on, let's just pick, I don't know, reliability benefits, then it's not helping us differentiate things. Maybe we shouldn't pay attention to that. Maybe we should pay attention to other things. But then we also, as analysts, have to be good at analyzing what that means. And so we'd better, if we're going to offer that as a valid measure, we had better be darn sure that it is a robust measure and it is trustworthy. And that comes back to transparency. If you have the time in the communications plan, you show the decision makers and the stakeholders why they should trust that reliability measure, which again speaks to the question of the communications lift, as my planning colleagues call it. Other questions? Yes, sir.
You mentioned advocacy groups can sometimes get involved with agencies, and I think that can be a real win-win, but it's, I guess, delicate. Can you think of any examples where it played out well or not, and how that relationship was formed?
Sure. I'll cite some cases from the Seattle area where I worked for many years. I think that I just want to be clear, first of all, by saying that because, being a stakeholder, you asked the question earlier about sort of who are the people we're reaching out to. Living in the region makes you a stakeholder, right? By definition, that's the country we live in. No one should be excluded from the ability to offer their view. And so how do people do that? Well, they, in many cases, form organizations. So I want to be careful to say that I'm not making any value judgments about the type of organization that people choose to belong to or to bring to the table. But in terms of advocacy groups, clearly they have an objective to advocate for a position. And so, that we just need to understand that. But it can be successful where there's sort of a common interest around the fact that that's their job, and so they should be at the table. We have lobbyists in Washington, right? So there are groups who advocate for all sorts of positions, and in a democracy, you try to listen to those groups. So there are sort of shared cooperative efforts where a lot of bicycle advocacy groups, for example, I'm a cyclist, go out and do bicycle counts, the National Bike and Ped Documentation Program. And so there are areas where there's an alignment of interest, and so there's sort of this mutual area of cooperation that then gets people talking to each other in productive ways. So, and the other way is just the fact that in a democracy, we should make voices heard. So people, this group is free to speak, that group's free to speak. So there's the point is that there's sort of there shouldn't be a penalty to come to the table. Does that make sense? But the success stories really, I think, are, if you look at it from the advocacy group side, and I'm not really qualified to speak, but what I've seen is I think that folks who engage the process kind of in the spirit of this is a democracy and this is how it works, and there needs to be some two-way communications, have been more successful at achieving results that work for everyone. If that helps. That's my opinion. I'm not counseling people what to do here. I can't really do that as a Metro employee. But does that answer your question?
Yep.
We run out of time before we close. Next week we'll have Professor Rand Wei from University of Utah to talk about uncertainty, addressing uncertainty in the ACS, American Community Data. With that, let's thank Jeff.